Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Dan Moulthrop, I'm Chief Executive here, and I'm also a proud member, and I'm pleased to introduce our forum today, a panel conversation focused on how eviction affects our neighbors here in Northeast Ohio. Today's forum is part of the work we are doing with One Community Reads, a county-wide collaboration of our 9 public library systems, Playhouse Square, and your City Club to invite the entire community to read the same book. That book is Evicted: Profit and Poverty in the American City, written by Matthew Desmond. Every branch of every library in the county has been presenting book clubs, conversations, panels on these issues, and today's event is one of our contributions to the conversation, all of which culminates with an appearance by Matthew Desmond at a free event at Playhouse Square on March 15th, which is sponsored by the Ohio Humanities Council and Western Reserve Area Agency on Aging. Our forum today is also part of our Resilient Families series, sponsored by the St. Luke's Foundation and the William J. and Dorothy K. O'Neill Foundation. When the series was conceived 18 months ago, the very first speaker under consideration was Matthew Desmond, and it's not hard to imagine why. Knowing you have a stable home in a safe neighborhood can provide emotional and social security, and yes, resilience during life's most challenging times. And of course, surviving an eviction also requires an enormous amount of resilience itself. As Matthew Desmond points out in the prologue of the book, the experience of eviction is surprisingly common and ordinary in most U.S. cities. Though his Pulitzer Prize-winning book is reported in Milwaukee, he writes, quote, "There's nothing special about Milwaukee when it comes to eviction. The numbers are similar in Kansas City, Cleveland, Chicago, and other cities. In 2013, 1 in 8 poor renting families nationwide were unable to pay off all of their rent, and a similar number thought it was likely they would be evicted soon." But simply knowing that 1 in 8 poor families might be on the verge of eviction does not describe the true reality that many of our neighbors are facing. So today we've assembled a group of local voices who are confronting eviction through the courts, through their own lived experience, and other areas, and we're going to have a conversation about the solutions that might change the situation for our families and neighbors at the margins. Guiding today's conversation is Amy Eddings. She's host of Morning Edition on 90.3 WCPN IdeaStream, which is our primary media partner. Prior to returning home to Northeast Ohio, Ms. Eddings was a longtime host of All Things Considered on WNYC. Ms. Eddings, I turn the forum over to you to introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan, and welcome everybody. Thank you for being here, and I hope we have a really robust and interesting conversation today. Oh, is this weird feedback? How am I sounding? Okay. Sounds weird to me, but I don't have my headphones on, so. Matthew Desmond says we've failed as a nation to appreciate how evictions are not just a consequence of poverty. He says it creates poverty. And so I'm hoping that through the course of our conversation this afternoon, we really get a sense of that, frame it for what it means and how it looks in Cleveland, and then move on to some of the solutions that Desmond is recommending in his book and whether they can apply here in Cleveland. So let's get started, and I'm going to start with the Honorable Ron O'Leary, judge in Housing Court in Cleveland Municipal Court. Welcome.
Thank you.
So give me a thumbnail sketch of how an eviction goes down. I fail to pay my rent. What happens?
And in Cleveland, the not paying the rent is the most likely reason that a tenant is going to be evicted. We see on average about 11,000 civil cases in housing court. Our court has exclusive jurisdiction over landlord-tenant matters in Cleveland and Bratenahl. So of those 11,000, most of those are eviction cases. And of those eviction cases, most, most of the reason for the eviction is not paying the rent. So when we have our tenant forums and our landlord forums, I always will tell the tenants, whatever else is going on, pay your rent or put it into rent deposit, because that's going to get you evicted if you don't pay your rent. So the process is that the landlord would file the eviction case. Our court schedules the eviction hearing 3 weeks from the date of filing.
Well, first I get a notice,
Yes.
though. I get a
Oh,
3-day
correct.
notice.
That's correct. I'm
that-
sorry, I'm skipping
Yes.
over some.
What,
So,
what happens
yeah.
to me?
The 3-day notice, the 3-day notice is the notice to the tenant from the landlord to leave. And that is for the not paying the rent.
And I have 3 days to leave, or the landlord's going to take me to court.
Correct.
Okay.
And there are tenants that do leave on either a 3-day notice or a 30-day notice for issues other than non-payment. And they do that because they don't want the eviction record.
And the 30-day would be my landlord caught me with a pet and there's a no pet clause.
It's typically
or
for any other breach of the
my
lease.
boyfriend has moved in and I wasn't allowed to have anybody else in the apartment. Okay.
Yes, or just if there is a month to month and the landlord decides that the landlord doesn't want you there anymore. So it can be for those variety of reasons, but the tenants oftentimes don't want the eviction record on their background check.
And that happens regardless of whether that gets adjudicated, right?
That's correct.
The moment my landlord files, what's it called, a claim or a notice of
Well, it's filing an eviction complaint.
complaint. Once he or she files a complaint against me, that's on my record regardless of how it gets.
That's correct, and there's no analogous process to seal a civil record as opposed to a criminal, where there are criminal convictions that the records can be sealed after a period of time under certain circumstances. There's nothing analogous with an eviction complaint or some other type of a civil case. So once it's there, and that can really close a lot of doors to tenants in the future.
And finally, since this is a breach of contract, is there anything else that would bring it to the level of a court case? In other words, isn't it sort of cut and dried? You didn't pay, you've got to go. How is it that it would actually proceed to a hearing before your bench?
Well, it would be that once the filing takes place, we set it for a hearing, and that's 3 weeks after the complaint is filed. And it goes to typically one of the magistrates in housing court, and they hear the case. And the landlord does have to present evidence to prove the allegations in the complaint, but frequently the tenant does not come to the hearing, or when they do, the landlord, particularly ones that have been in the landlord business for a period of time, they know what evidence they have to present, and so they do come prepared. So most of the cases that move forward with hearing in housing court, the court does grant the eviction request for the landlord. That's the first cause hearing, and then the second cause, if the landlord has a claim for any money damages, for unpaid rent, for damage beyond normal wear and tear or other damages, then the landlord has that second claim, and that's typically done at a separate hearing.
Hazel Remish of Legal Aid, welcome. So you represent tenants in housing court, or Legal Aid is often the place where a tenant would go to seek legal assistance. Can you tell me how many landlord-tenant disputes Legal Aid is handling in any given year?
So at Legal Aid, we receive about 100,000 phone calls a year for intakes. Of those calls, about 17% of them are cases related to housing. And we can only represent about 44% of the people that seek our assistance because of lack of resources. We generally screen for eligibility and for merit, so we don't. So in cases where we get involved, it means that we have determined that there is a legal defense that we can present to that eviction.
So the funnel really starts to narrow, right? 100,000 calls overall. 14,765 fill out applications to get legal help. Of those, 2,505 are related to housing. And then you can help a little less than half of that because you don't have enough resources to provide legal help for everybody who has qualified to meet it.
That's correct. And I mean, even in the cases where it is a straight up non-payment of rent case like the judge just mentioned, there are lots of benefits to providing legal representation to those tenants. I mean, you really give tenants the ability to have a soft landing when they have an attorney present. It empowers tenants to know what their rights are, what their options are, to really make meaningful decisions to their family and to participate meaningfully in that process and with dignity. And so while we can only help a small number of people because of our lack of resources, there really is a benefit to expanding that, not just in the very small funnel that we represent.
So it sounds like, Judge, most of the cases coming before you, the tenants are not represented.
Most of the cases, that's correct.
And how does that usually go for them?
Well, like I said, some of the issues that Hazel pointed out, when there is representation for the tenants, number one, the attorney can advise them what their rights are. And our staff does make sure to have the landlords and the tenants follow the proper procedures, but it does put the tenants at a disadvantage when they're not represented, even against a landlord that's representing himself or herself, because the tenant doesn't have as much information or as much experience usually. So, it is, an issue with not having tenants represented. I think that overall, the City Club sponsoring this forum, is a good way for us to really talk about a lot of the issues that are there, but also look at some of the solutions. And in Cleveland, I could say that increasing tenant representation is good for the tenants, but in many ways is also good for the landlords. So that as both parties know their rights and responsibilities and what the law is, when people follow them, that's better for everyone overall.
And we're just now talking of the subset of landlord-tenant disputes that actually get to the court. As you noted, in that when I get my 3-day notice, oftentimes I choose to move voluntarily rather than fight it in court because I don't want that eviction notice on my record. This is where I'm turning to Chris Canary with the Housing Center. Welcome.
Thank you.
So who's getting evicted? Who is facing this either forced eviction or voluntary eviction? Can you paint a picture of the face of eviction in Cleveland?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, as is highlighted throughout the book, eviction is not an equal opportunity challenge or circumstance that families face. We have a higher probability that we will experience eviction in our lives based on our race, our sex, disability, and our family status. Single black mothers in the book, and we see this locally in the folks who call our office for help with complaints of housing discrimination. These are folks who are particularly vulnerable, and that has to do with our history of racist public policies and individual actions as well of discrimination. And if we look at the county, we have about 27,000 evictions a year. That was statistics from the year 2016, 27,000 eviction cases filed in the courts of the county. And in some communities, it's quite high. The city of Euclid, for example, they don't have a huge renter population. It's 11,000 families rent. Nearly 1 in 5 could have faced an eviction given the number of filings that year in the city of Euclid. And in that community, renter households account for over 3/4 of the population of renter households are folks of color, and 30% have children. So we see this throughout the courts, and I took a look at several courts throughout the area, easiest for places that just have one city. But Cleveland is in the same bucket that the county overall is in. About 1 in 11 families who rent have an eviction filed in the courts. And as you point out in the book, only 24% in the study from Milwaukee of forced moves went through the court process with a filing.
Right, and Matthew Desmond does a really great job of looking at the systemic forces that have prevented African Americans from home ownership because of federal housing laws,
Yes.
Redlining, a lack of access to capital, so they're more likely to be renters and more likely to be affected by housing policies and with non-payment of rent, getting evicted. Chris, many of the people Desmond followed in his book have trouble finding an apartment because they have kids. They're told straight out they don't take families. Is that a violation of fair housing laws?
It is.
It is, okay.
Yes.
So how is it that they do that? And on the other side of it, trying to look at it from a landlord's point of view, how do you balance that with maybe legitimate fire code and housing code requirements that I can't have a mom with 5 kids in a 2-bedroom unit?
Well, we have occupancy codes to address the issue of overcrowding. And you're right, you don't want an overcrowding situation or circumstance, and many families live in overcrowded situations. At the time of lease up, when a housing provider lists a place for rent, we always encourage them to look at what is the square footage, what's the occupancy policy in my community, and advertise no more than, my unit, my 2-bedroom unit, based on its square footage, can house up to 5 people. Then I'm not parsing out whether it's adults or children, right? We can have up to 5 people in this unit. And I know if a family contacts me that has 6, I can say that would be over occupancy, right? That's not a violation to comply with a local occupancy code, but it can be a violation if housing providers say only 2 people in a 2-bedroom that could house 4, right? Or I'm going to charge extra for your children. We have, families call us with this kind of stuff all the time, denied because the landlord didn't think it would be a comfortable situation. It seems more crowded than it should be, but the unit wasn't too small according to local codes. We hear from folks dealing with these kinds of struggles all the time.
And is there any remedy or any recourse?
Yes, absolutely. Folks should call our office, should call legal aid. Our office works specifically with complaints of housing discrimination, and we can provide assistance with filing a free, no attorney required, administrative complaint with any federal, state, or local enforcement agency, depending on the nature of the violation.
Will Brown is an addiction counseling assistant at Stella Maris. Welcome.
Thank you.
You had a housing voucher. Matthew Desmond advocates for universal housing vouchers in the book, and we'll talk about that later as a solution step. You were given an eviction notice because of a change in your job status and a communications breakdown. Let's put it generously at that, between you and your landlord. You got that eviction notice. Desmond writes a lot about the stresses of eviction on people. Can you talk a little bit about that experience for you and how you dealt with it?
Well, an eviction is going to be pretty stressing because the first thing that I had to worry about, okay, I don't want to lose my voucher. And there are many housing voucher programs out there where they pay a portion of your rent. And the tenant, that'll be me, I pay according to my income. As the income changes, then I go back to wherever the voucher comes from and take care of that. That's where the communication snafu came from between my landlord and I. He received the letter that told what the lower amount of my rent would be. I never got it. So I was like really stressed out. I got to go to court. It was not a great experience. I mean, I'm a
You did take it to
college
court, though.
student.
You went to court?
I went to court. My case was the first case called that morning, and I was coming from the hospital where my wife was in Youngstown, and I was late. It was over with. I explained my situation. They sent me to another desk. That desk sent me to another desk, and it was so much. The great thing of my story is that I had just gotten married, and my wife had a house. So I didn't have to worry about going to some of the lengths that other people have to go to, like maybe going to the shelter, sleeping in abandoned houses on the street, or just being worried about what am I going to do next. But that's a best case scenario. Matthew talked about in the book how so many people, especially in the African American community, if their family and their community is the greatest resource, once that is taken away, the person just become a part of this big overarching system where they're just a number or a name, and they're waiting and they're waiting and they're worried. Kids need to eat. I mean, come on. I remember being in second grade and being taught food, clothing, and shelter is our basic needs. And this is a winter city, just like Milwaukee is in the book. So you take away shelter, that's definitely a very stressing situation.
Well, in reading about the landlords in Desmond's book, Sharena and Tobin. Did you develop any new understanding of them? The landlord
You
side.
have to answer that question.
Okay, next question.
Yes, yes. I love America. I think America is the greatest country on earth. You know, I love democracy, capitalism, and free enterprise. But as I read the book, I was amazed at how people take advantage of free enterprise. Matthew made the comment in his book that the landlord take advantage of poverty. He talked about how in certain areas where the property value is low, so home ownership there is not good, it's not feasible, but it's great for a landlord to come in and take a house that really should house one family and carve it up and make 4 units out of a house that was designed to just be one house. And so my views of landlords, I know some landlords in this room. There's probably some good ones in here. But I'm willing to bet if there are 10 landlords in this room, there's probably one that fits the profile of these two.
He describes a cycle of landlords at the bottom of the market don't lower rents to meet demand and avoid the cost of evictions because it's just cheaper to deal with evictions than to maintain properties. They can skimp on maintenance if tenants were behind. Tenants get behind because the rent is high. Would this be solved by a universal voucher system? Let's make the pivot in the 7 minutes we have left to talking about some of the solution steps that Desmond talked about. Hazel, with Legal Aid, I'll start with you. How would a voucher program help address some of these inequities?
I mean, when we're talking about the voucher program, we're really talking about like the Cadillac of subsidies, right? I mean, it is a voucher that a tenant can use in a private market, and both.
It goes with you.
It goes with you wherever you move, and one important factor of that voucher is that there is an agency that performs an inspection to make sure that it meets housing quality standards, and so those are all components that are really important in thinking about solutions and affordability, because there's a really deep subsidy attached to that. You know, it moves based on the tenant's income. And going back to some of the stress, we know that families that have faced eviction have a disruption in the education of their children. We know that they are more likely to lose their jobs. We know that they experience a lot of stress and psychological trauma as a result of eviction. And so really having a system in place such as a voucher program, the right to counsel that that Matthew Desmond also addresses as a solution, which is part of the work that with the Sisters of Charity that we're focusing on, really addresses some of those issues in essentially stabilizing housing for these already marginalized families.
Judge, I wanted to talk about the programs that the Housing Court does offer. You mentioned that there are landlord and tenant classes.
Yes.
You also offer mediation. I'm wondering though if those how popular are those classes, first of all?
Well, the landlord class we do them once a quarter. We typically have anywhere from 50 to 75 people that are there. About half of them are usually there because they want to be, and the other half are because I ordered them as part of their probation. So.
What about on the tenant side, though? If part of this is empowering tenants and reminding them what their rights are, and in particular to get the word out that, hey, if you've got a dispute over a broken window, don't do a rent strike. That's not going to help you.
Right.
How popular are your tenant classes, and how are you getting the word out about that?
I've been at the court less than a year, and we have not had a tenant course yet, and it's because it's hard to actually do the tenant outreach. And to this point, some other agencies had been able to offer some services. With Cleveland Tenant Organization suspending its operations recently, that's left a significant gap in resources that are available for tenants. And so my staff and I are looking at how we can start to really get the tenant course available throughout the city. We've had some discussions with CMHA about
CMHA
I'm sorry,
stands for?
Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority.
We're trying to be a jargon-free
Yes,
zone up here.
I'm sorry. So yeah, our local housing authority. So working with them on some issues, so that may be an avenue there. But we do have several thousand people come to our court and seek our services, in addition to the neighborhood clinics. And so with that, we do get several thousand people per year. It breaks down almost evenly between tenants and landlords, coming down with a little bit heavier number of landlords.
I want to make 2 points to that. I was intrigued in Desmond's book when he talked about how African Americans search for housing, and that they rely on kinship networks and word of mouth and social networks more than they rely on realtor offices or associations or anything like that. And I'm wondering if the same holds true for your tenant housing class, tenants' rights class, that perhaps it would be better to spread that word through social networks rather than hosting a class at the courthouse once a quarter.
Well, we don't actually have them at the courthouse. We do these out in the neighborhoods. And we have our neighborhood clinics as well, that I think last year we had 7 or 8 clinics, not specifically focused on either landlord or tenant issues, but housing issues in general. This year we have 5 scheduled. We may add a 6th, but what we do there is that we do work with the community development corporations. We work with the local council members and other partner agencies to get the word out about those. And we just had one at Harvard Community Services on Wednesday night. That's usually one of our best attended. I don't have the numbers, but I believe that we probably had north of 250 to 300 people that were there. So it's a good outreach system there, but we are looking at ways to improve that so that we can let tenants know more about the resources the court offers.
And Chris Canary, I'll end with you before we pivot to taking your questions. This talk of a universal voucher, we already have voucher programs in place. What does Desmond mean when he talks about its universality? Who currently is eligible to get vouchers?
Well, right now, very low income and extremely low income people by HUD's definition of income are eligible, but right now we have 1 voucher for every 4 people who qualify. That's the funding problem that we have. We are subsidizing homeowners, and in large part wealthy homeowners, through mortgage interest deductions and other means. But we are underfunding the need for supportive services and housing assistance, emergency assistance, voucher subsidies for the most vulnerable in our communities.
One last question, and this should have come earlier in the conversation. It was something that I asked the judge in my pre-interview of him. This 3 days, this 3-day notice, why just 3 days? Is there any opportunity or is there any discretion? I know that's how the law is written, but is there any discretion that you have to soften the impact of eviction, give a tenant more time? Why is it that a tenant has a 3-day notice of eviction where if I don't pay my mortgage, it'll be 12 to 24 months before the sheriff comes knocking at my door to repossess the house on behalf of the bank?
With this, all of the evictions are governed by Ohio tenant landlord law. And so we have to follow what the statute requires. And it lays out the difference for when 3 days appropriate for not paying the rent and 30-day for other situations. It is meant by its nature to be a fast turnaround. The eviction itself is an equitable remedy where the landlord is saying that the tenant didn't abide by one of the requirements of the landlord-tenant relationship, and that's the way that it is set out. I have to, as the judge, follow what the law is, but we have some ability to work with the parties, and that's why we have our mediation program. And for the mediations that we do, there's a fairly high success rate. We're at about 85% of cases that go to mediation where the parties come to some agreement. That doesn't mean the tenant stays. It just means that they're able to resolve the issues that brought them to court through an agreed entry versus the magistrates or me making a decision. So that's another area that we're looking at, particularly now that CTO, Cleveland Tenants Organization, has suspended their operations, is really looking at how can we increase our mediation services at the court, because I think that that's a better outcome most of the time than having just the magistrates and myself make a decision.
And the nuances in property law between an owner and a tenant?
Again, they're governed by different sets of law, and so I have to look at a situation where under the law is the landlord entitled to the eviction, and if the landlord is, there's really very limited circumstances where my court and I feel comfortable extending something because it's not what the law requires. We do look at some extraordinary circumstances, such as a sudden medical emergency that arose. We've granted the eviction order, and the tenant is in a severe car accident. The tenant says, well, I don't want to be set out now, I'm in the hospital. We will give some amount of extension on extreme cases, but it really has to be something that was unforeseen at the time of the decision.
I'm Amy Eddings, WCPN's Morning Edition host and producer, and today we are enjoying a Friday forum on how eviction is affecting residents of Northeast Ohio, featuring Will Brown, an addiction counselor at Stella Maris, Chris Canary, Associate Director for the Housing Center, the Honorable Ronald O'Leary, Judge for Cleveland Municipal Court, and Hazel Remish, Supervising Attorney at the Legal Aid Society of Greater Cleveland. This is the part where you get to ask questions. We welcome questions from everyone, from City Club members, guests, students, those of you joining us via our radio broadcast on WCPN, our webcast, or our Facebook Live video. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, or leave your question in the comments section of Facebook, and the City Club staff will try to work it into the program. So holding the microphones today are Content Coordinator Bliss Davis and Youth Forum Council Chair Tiolu Orasanya. Am I getting your name right? Okay, great. May we have the first question, please, for our guests?
Good afternoon. My name is Merle Johnson. I'm a member of the State Board of Education. And in order to curb chronic absenteeism, the legislature passed House Bill 410, which deals with schools forming teams to deal with students to help students who are chronically absent. And when students are absent, parents receive a letter which is kind of threatening. If you don't send your child to school, further action will be taken. My question is there any kind of communication where a parent can receive a letter or something from the court, a parent who's going through eviction and so forth, to try to explain to the school why that child has been absent? Is there any kind of communication between schools and the courts?
Hazel, I'm going to ask you if you can field that. What's your experience with your clients communicating with their local schools?
So my experience has been that there is not that communication. But really the root of the issue is that if there's an eviction that is causing the child to miss school, the root is the eviction, and that's what needs to be addressed, right? So if we're talking about a child not missing school, underachieving, not testing high enough in tests, repeating grades, those are all results of eviction. And so while the communication probably should be there, really the root cause is avoiding that eviction to stabilize the housing so that the child is no longer missing that, the importance of education.
Thank you for your question.
Homeless veterans in this area. Excuse me. And do your programs affect the homeless veterans and work for them on their behalf? There was also an announcement in today's Plain Dealer that the property that houses these homeless veterans on, I believe, East 105th Street has been sold. Do you think that will have any effect on these veterans?
Chris, would you like to address the rights that veterans have in housing? Housing subsidies and Section 8?
Right. There are a number of subsidy vehicles. Like there is a specific voucher targeting veteran homelessness that is earmarked and that communities have applied for. We have them here in Cuyahoga County and that get used. They're called VASH vouchers for short, and they are intended to help reduce homelessness for folks who have served. We also have in our state law an additional protection that doesn't exist at the federal level from housing discrimination based on veteran status,
Now,
military status.
can veterans lose the right to that voucher, though, if they've got drug problems?
I believe there are some additional, and we've got some experts in the room here from the Housing Authority and others who administer these vouchers and who work hand in hand with them, Veteran Service Commission, et cetera. There are some additional protections built in for those vouchers. They're a little different than the traditional housing choice voucher that was formerly known as Section 8.
And again, it's discretionary, right? The federal laws allow for a landlord to reject an applicant with a voucher if they have a violent felony record, but
Well,
it's not mandated.
Our federal laws allow housing providers to reject a voucher for any reason. There is no protection based on source of income or subsidy right now at the federal or state level in Ohio. We have a few local cities that have passed ordinances. I'd like to call their names, visit our website. We have them listed there on our State of Fair Housing report on an annual basis. I think there's a need for a countywide and a statewide ordinance or legislation to ensure that anybody who is one of those lucky 1 in 4 to get a voucher gets an opportunity to live in a place that they can let their children play outside, where their children aren't going to be poisoned by lead dust in their homes, where they're going to have a chance at a quality school education. And right now, what we have found in our recent research on this issue we released in December, source of income discrimination in Cuyahoga County, is that of the properties outside of high poverty and highly segregated areas where voucher holders already live, of the properties that would be affordable to them with the current subsidy available through the voucher program, 90% of landlords are still saying no.
Mm-hmm. Will Brown, you wanted to speak to that?
Absolutely. I remember when I received my voucher and being given the list by the agency to go, because it's a self-sufficiency thing. The person goes out and looks and finds the apartment or the house. Everywhere that I went that was safe and secure, they didn't take vouchers. They absolutely refused. It is a sad state of affairs, you know, because I know it's a lot of people in here, I mentioned before, a lot of nonprofit agencies in here. Nonprofit agencies help people overcome barriers. That's what they exist for. So the majority of the people who receive a voucher are people who you would say are people being given a second chance from whatever it is, addiction, rehabilitation from the criminal justice system. And this person comes out with this hope, like, okay, I can get a place to live. And so a recovering addict does not want to live in an area of East Cleveland where it's drug dealers standing on every corner and they're selling dope out of most of the apartments in the house. And I just use East Cleveland, but any neighborhood. But guess what though? 9 times out of 10, unless you know somebody that knows somebody, as in my case, I had to pick a building that took vouchers. I was the only sober person that lived in that building. All day, all night, I heard knocking on doors, and I would have to pray so hard and use so many of the tools they gave me. But if there was a law in place, and Matthew Desmond talked about it in the book, he stated a universal voucher program would change the face of poverty in this country. Because if the landlord can't say, no, we're not going to take you because you have the voucher, but you meet every other criteria, and the vouchers will cover the rent.
But there's some question too about whether vouchers are being appropriately managed. He raises in the book this concern about overcharging. Overcharging voucher holders cost taxpayers an additional $3.6 million each year in Milwaukee alone. Some sense that what used to be known as Section 8 vouchers resulted in an overinflation of rents because it was based on a median for a large, am I getting this right? A large geographic area that could lump together Beechwood, Lakewood, and East Cleveland. Hazel, could you speak to that about ways that we might develop some kind of program that would be fair to taxpayers as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've been advocating for a mobility program with our local housing authority, you know, really thinking about how can you take that voucher into areas where there might be more opportunities for those participants. And so when we're talking about mobility, we're talking about some of the issues that Chris just brought up, right? So safety, education. And so a mobility program would be a way to address that so that people can take that voucher into different neighborhoods should they choose to. And one thing that I wanted to mention about the voucher program, going back to the gentleman's question, is that in the voucher program, there's a high risk. So if there's an eviction, that eviction will jeopardize not only your participation in that program, but it will jeopardize your participation in for future subsidized housing in the future. And so it's really crucial that we preserve that when we're really thinking about these issues, you know, from an eviction perspective.
Do we have another question from the audience?
Hi, I'm South Euclid City Councilman Marty Gelfand, and Judge O'Leary mentioned the loss of the Cleveland Tenants Organization. That was probably the most important resource in my toolbox when people would call me. And you mentioned that, you know, there's some mitigation through mediation in your court, but I'd like to ask all the panel members, if they can, to say what other resources are available that I can recommend to people who call me or people who are just seeking help for their situation.
Who wants to start?
So at Legal Aid, you know, we have recently, CTO is a huge loss to the community, and we recently began staffing the information line that CTO was handling for the rental information and eviction diversion. So we are a resource that is available to tackle on those two main programs that CTO was handling.
Shortly after it was announced that CTO had suspended operations, one of our council members, Tony Brancatelli, and I reached out to CTO's board. And I've been saying suspended because that is how they have said their situation is. I've talked to the board members, and they are now assessing really what their core functions, you know, should be moving forward, and then seeing if there is a way that they can reopen and start offering services again. So I want to let people know at least that is happening. It's, you know, not that they are closed permanently. I can't say that won't be the case, but they are looking to see how they may be able to reestablish themselves. And I think that any of us that are involved in this issue would really, you know, encourage them and offer whatever support that we can for that. But other resources that are available, I think that if we could find a way to have a more robust tenant representation, that would be an enormous improvement. But then one thing that is moving forward that Desmond touched on in the book, it only mentioned it a few times about the inspectors. And that is something that with an inspection program for rental units, that is going to really just hold the landlords responsible. And the types of landlords that were discussed in the book, they obviously hurt tenants, but they hurt the good landlords too, because good landlords are at a competitive disadvantage for the landlords that don't fix their property. I was talking to someone last night who owns a fair number of properties in Cleveland, and he said, I'm not just renting a place, I'm also selling someone my services. And he was describing how, you know, he has services available so that if something breaks in the middle of the night on a weekend, the tenants don't have to wait until Monday. He gets his people over there to fix it now. Mm-hmm. And he's at a disadvantage for the landlords that don't fix something because, as it was in the book, they're in Vegas or in the Caribbean. So having that rental inspection program, which the Cleveland Building Department just implemented last year, that's going to keep the landlords, you know, responsible. And they're not going to do, the plan is not to do a white glove inspection. It's to hit the life safety issues like smoke detectors, operational plumbing, safe electrical, flues operational. And that, I think, is going to be a huge improvement in Cleveland's rental market to have that program.
So let's talk about Sharena and Tobin for a minute,
Yes.
and I'd be interested in hearing from people who read the book. I don't know that they were bad landlords. I mean, they made some. I think they made some really hard, mean decisions, but there were also instances in which they worked with people, they looked the other way. It was, to me, it was a little bit more complicated than that. I tended to like Sharena a little bit more than I liked Tobin. I think she had more of a soft spot. But oftentimes, Matthew Desmond has scenes in which she's berating herself for having a heart and for giving somebody a break because they failed to come through with the rent that they had promised her. So I'm wondering if anybody else struggled with how they felt about these two characters in the book.
Obviously, in the audience, I didn't have an issue so much with them working or not working with tenants. What I had the issue with was them not maintaining their properties. That if they had, if the properties, were, the plumbing wasn't backing up, my read on the fire, there weren't smoke detectors there. And there was a baby that died, and if they would have just had the smoke detectors there and operational, that baby would not have died. And Desmond himself discussing that in his own trailer, which was the nicest one that he saw, he didn't have any hot water or heat because the flue wasn't connected and he could have died from carbon monoxide. So whether the landlord let somebody slide or not, or if they would have just been 100% by the book and just got somebody out, I didn't have a problem with that because they legally could do it. I had the problem with the living conditions that the tenants were living in, and that the landlords were just taking money over and over and over for properties that largely people shouldn't have been living in.
Hazel, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I think also it's not only the condition, and I would not categorize them as great landlords, because they made conscious decisions, right? So we're not going to provide a stove because if it breaks down, it's going to cost me too much to go and fix it. That is not a good landlord. And so I think that they really focused on what was in their best interest. I'm not saying that landlords shouldn't be looking at what is, obviously they're in the business to make money. But that being said, they really made some really conscious decisions to not provide a certain service because they didn't want to carry that burden. And a lot of times it's a lot easier for a landlord to say, I'm not going to make that repaired. I'm not going to address that lead hazard. I'm not going to, fix that and find a pretext to evict or to look for a reason to evict the tenant, because that is the easier outcome than to actually make that repair and provide that safe, decent, affordable housing.
Will?
I have to part company with you on that too. I don't think Sharena nor Tobin were good landlords. I think they were people that was about.
I'm not saying good, complicated.
Complicated. And I quote some examples in Sharena's case especially because I actually thought she was worse than Tobin. But the thing of having your tenants believe that they did some work on their property. If they did the repairs themselves, okay, I'm gonna cut you a break on the rent. The guy had no legs. He walked around on his stumps and painted the whole inside of the house.
For those of you who didn't read the book,
she didn't like the way he did it.
He's describing a scene in which Sharena evicts a gentleman named Lamar, who I believe he's a vet, and
he was a vet.
Yeah, and lost his legs and was in a wheelchair, and he thought he could do some work and paint a vacant apartment, and he got some of his relatives to help him, and they did a sloppy job. But he thought that they had a verbal agreement that she would discount that off of his rent, and it was a verbal agreement, so she said, no, this is a terrible job, I'm not paying you for that. So, and I think he was in arrears $30 for his rent, and she evicted him for that.
Read the book.
Yeah.
Read the book and see how disgusting
All right,
they are.
just to morally complicate the waters a little bit here, as if I haven't already. Reading from the book itself, Desmond writes, throughout American, this is in his notes are almost as long as the book. Throughout American history, city politicians have attempted to place checks on landlords' power and improve tenants' lives by laying down rules, from slum clearance to building code enforcement, as if the underlying problem were not America's abundance of poverty and lack of affordable housing, but disorder and inefficiency. This often brings unanticipated consequences that increase tenants' hardship. Chris, I'm wondering how you respond when you hear him lay that out like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about that gets addressed extensively in the book is the issue of nuisance ordinances. Some researchers who are in the room from Cleveland State and the ACLU of Ohio did some work here locally. We have over 20 nuisance ordinances, criminal abatement nuisance ordinances here in Cuyahoga County. And what we see is that they are in large part enforced against renters, families of color, and victims of domestic violence, people with disabilities, calling for help. We had in the book, Crystal couldn't take it anymore when Trisha, her upstairs neighbor, was getting abused by her boyfriend. And she called the police, she called 911 after Arlene told her, don't do that. and it backfired, right? Not only did Trisha get evicted because the police said it was not acceptable that she get off with a warning, but the police recommended that Sharina also go on and evict Arlene and Crystal from the downstairs unit, and they were kicked out as well as a result of one additional call. It was a series of calls, but this one finally was the tipping point for a 911 call to help somebody who was actively being battered in their home. And that leads to family eviction, and then families move, right? And when you have the 3 days to move, you don't get to make a good choice about what's going to be great for your family, right? You are in a desperate situation because if you don't want that to show up on your record for another landlord to hold it against you for the next however many years, right? You have to make a split-second decision, and families are burdened by this. They are making choices out of desperation, and they don't have good options, and we really need to step up. We know this. We're reading about it. We see it. We know it locally. We all know it. Like right now, we need to figure out what are the strategies and solutions to address it, right? Because otherwise, we're complicit with this problem.
One, and we have 5 minutes left before we're wrapping up here, but I wanted to make sure that this information got out here because it was news to me, and I think it may change how we think about this legislation or proposed legislation given what we're reading in this community read with this book, Evicted. There are two bills, and Chris and Hazel will help me elaborate on them, but there are two bills currently in before the State House that lawmakers are considering that would further complicate matters for tenants. One is trying to define what it means by 3 days. And my current understanding, and Judge O'Leary, you can tell me what Cuyahoga County, how your court, or Cleveland, how your court defines 3 days. But there's legislation before state lawmakers that would define a day as a day. Meaning not a business day, but a day, and that you have 3 days to get out or have an eviction proceeding started against you. And advocates for the homeless are noting that if this were to go into effect, what this means, for example, and our recent Christmas holiday was a good example, you get a notice of eviction on Friday before Christmas, you would have 3 days, not counting holidays or weekends, to move. So meaning you would have to be moving Christmas Day. I'm wondering what your 3 day, what you consider 3 days in your court.
I told the magistrates I may have to look to one of them on this. I believe that the state law change is clarifying that a day is a day. But I believe that's currently what we do, that we count weekends and holidays as well. So thank you, Magistrate Embry. So yes, we do. And so, but I think there's been some confusion on that, and that's I'm not saying good or bad, but that this bill would clarify that.
Against tenants. Yeah, and the last bill would criminalize damages to apartments, and that criminalization record would follow you and mandate that you do not get federal or subsidized housing programs, correct?
Right, and folks can already be charged and convicted with damaging. We don't need to create a new penalty under the law, and we don't need to create a new barrier, because communities are also working collectively across the state to try and address reentry issues and ensure that folks with past criminal convictions do have the right to return and live as full and participating members in our society. And this would create one extra hurdle for rehousing folks post-incarceration.
So just something to follow and to talk to your state legislators about. Thank you very, very much.
You guys are all awesome. Thank you for being here. It's very clear that we did not get to the end of the conversation, so head to your local library, find out what's coming, and also please do join us on March 15th. That brings us to the end of our program. And I want to finally say, too, that you can get a copy of the book thanks to our friends at A Cultural Exchange. They are for sale, and there is a deep dive conversation as well happening right after this, just across the lobby in the Mandel Room. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Amy. Our forum is adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland Incorporated.